working. And it doesn't give me I've listened to it, so it looks like it's recording okay. And it's supposed to do sound correction and all that other kind of stuff, so we'll see. The problem is it's supposed to record YouTube format, but it records 2 large files. I think it gives me 4 gigs per, so 2 and then 2. And then I'll have to compress it. Because you don't care about this, do you? But anyway,
sort of commercial between.
Yeah, Dave cares. I Wondershare, if anyone needs to do compressive formats, reformatting, Wondershare is wonderful. I had to move it from another computer, and it said, you need to renew your stuff, and wanted you to buy a program. So I wrote to them. Online, they send you the password because you're on their record book online. So if you sign up, they say, yeah, we know who you are, and you just put in. I was up and running in like seconds, and I'm like, how many companies? The IRS sends you something, it takes 2 weeks to get to you. But Wondershare has it right there. I'm like, well, Shazam. Of course, they're Chinese companies, so they're probably, keeping track, monitoring everything, right? Yeah. Yeah.
You're comparing apples to rotten apples.
Yeah, apples to rotten apple. There you go. Okay, like I said, we're still doing depth by PowerPoint. And what I did this week is I left up Safar and Masharif because they are the words of the day. What I did is something I don't usually do. I put the Strong's Vines, these are Strong's because they're Old Testament, the Strong's numbers and Strong's information together. Usually you don't get it quite like this because what I did is I pulled the Asar for you, Aswar, which is the root for Masharif. You usually, if you're doing a strong search, you have to go find that, so I gave it to you. This is what I usually do, but I compress it when I give you words of the day. So I'm giving you some raw information just because. If you're interested in doing strong stuff, I suggest using a computer. I should mention Strong's and Vines. Strong's and Vines are the translators and studiers of words. Got basic dictionaries for Greek and Hebrew. Woodhouse is also a source. Woodhouse is probably the best source, but if you're not used to using Woodhouse, you're toast. So you have to know pretty good Greek to do Woodhouse. Vines is better for the Greek. It does only Greek. The Strong's is for both Greek and Hebrew. The Greek is not very good in Strong's. But in any case, so that's the words of the day. I won't go back over them. We've already studied them kind of, but you have that for your reference. What I want to do, though, is mention again, we have 3 tests when we look at veracity. If every class that I do when I teach, if I'm teaching you Sophocles, if I'm teaching you the New Testament, the Old Testament documents, if I'm teaching you Josephus, if I'm teaching you any works in antiquity, the very first thing that I do in every class is I teach veracity. Why study? Now, it's not unreasonable to study a work that doesn't have good veracity, right? It may have some legitimate point or purpose. Like, for example, I could teach you Oliver Twist. What's the veracity in Oliver Twist? It's fiction, right? So it has a veracity not based in a historical record, not based in a eyewitness or secondary. It's not history. But yet, what is it?
Historical fiction.
Right. It's
Yeah,
of
you
the
can't
time.
find cultural things.
It's like studying the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead may have no historical references, no important information, and they're spells for dead people. But what I can glean from them, and what we would learn from them, is the cultural references and the references of the religion of the people of that time, right? And so the historical veracity, what would be worthwhile is, I know I think I told you there's 4 or 9 of the documents available to us. Each one is significantly different than the other. But if we were to look at them in time and say, what changed over time, it might tell us something about the society. Likewise, if we studied Dickens, we studied Oliver Twist, we might learn something about the society he was writing in. Right? We might learn something about the society he's writing about. Is it worthwhile historically? Yeah, in a secondary sense. Is it worthwhile like a primary historical document? Not at all. But this is why you study veracity. When you look at veracity of the text, the bibliographical tests are, basically, it measures the merit of the work. It tells us how well the text was transmitted through time. In fact, we do this, we do this with Dickens' books. Dickens' books is a really good example because in Dickens' books, what do you note between the books that were published first, or it wasn't published as books first, it was published as, what do you call them, series. It was done as series, right? So what do we know when we look at the series and then when they put it finally in a book form? Misspellings, changes, word changes, spelling changes, changes in grammar, things where the author went back and corrected it. You see this in every kind of document. So if I looked at the textual transmission, for example, anybody notice problems in works that have come from the Gutenberg Project or even modern works that are on your Kindle?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, right? They're terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, did someone forget to edit these? Or, I think what's happening is you have really young editors who don't understand English very well, and they're basically correcting your and your, or two and two. They're correcting it incorrectly because they don't know the difference. And so you're getting corrections to grammar, or they don't understand who and whom, or I and me. They don't understand the correct proper use of speech. So what you're having is, when you look textually at works, even today we're seeing textual things. Like, for example, even modern works put into electronic format have issues that the books may not have. Isn't this interesting? This is all about veracity, because what we know as we study how text was transmitted through time, and this directly applies to the Torah. Why? Because that we don't have any of the original documents of any works in antiquity, and that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the Torah, and I didn't put, did I put up, no, I don't have the number, but I'm comparing the date of writing, the extent of the manuscript, which is bibliographical tests. You look at the number of extant manuscripts, you look at the span in time from the writing to the earliest extant manuscripts. Because the more text you have, the more assured you are that you have the text as it was already written, or you can put together the text as it was already written. The span of time tells you how well to expect. So, for example, if there's 1,000 years between the time when it was written and the time of the text you have, there may be some issues, right? If I have 20,000 texts like I do the New Testament with only, I don't have it up here, but only 60 years between them, between when it was written and the document I know I have a very accurate document. Anyway, veracity is critical for every piece of work or literature you get. So, when you go into a class, I would expect every teacher to teach, every professor to teach veracity first. That's why I do it. The second test, let's see, did I cover this okay? Merits of the work, we call it merit. The second test we were looking at is the internal test, and this is a degree. So we look at, if it's primary, it's eyewitness. If it's secondary, it's a report of an eyewitness. It's called hearsay in court. Tertiary is anything else, and none is opinion or not observable. So, for example, a thought or idea or an opinion. We also look at coherence, claims, and rationality. And that's what I was doing yesterday. And finally, I'll touch this. Well, we'll get to the external test itself. And I'll mention this. You see at the bottom? The number one rule or takeaway that you should have is this. A work of greater degree and merit is always considered better than any other source. So, for example, in the New Testament works, how does it compare by degree and merit to Josephus or any other work of antiquity? Well, magnitude's better. So, if you were to go to a professor or professorette in a university, and they told you, we're going to study the New Testament era, right? What document would you expect them to use?
The New Testament.
The New Testament. What did they use? Well, if I were an erudite person who studied like Veracity, I'd say, why would you use a tertiary source? What's wrong with you? Because guess what? Do historians use tertiary sources? No historian studies history with lesser degrees of merit unless there are no other documents. So, for example, if the New Testament says such and such, but Josephus says something else, what do you trust? The New Testament, because the merit and the degree of the witness is much greater. It's like up here. So when we look at documents, number one, we concluded, how does the Torah stand up against other documents in antiquity? It's equal. So now we have to look at what? The internal tests to see what the degree of merit is, or the degree, and we have to look at the external tests, and that's what we're doing. So I told you one of the things we look at is, for example, the rational, coherent, and I was giving examples. Somebody told me, stop doing that. You're going to be crazy. It's okay. But I'm going to continue a little bit because I think it's worth. Okay, I've read all these documents. I suspect you haven't. If you have, that's good. Most people would put them to, this would put them to sleep. I'm sorry, if you start falling asleep, I guess I'll have to jump up on a chair or something. But let me give you just a little bit. Here's the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is an epic poem from Hindu. Let's see, do I have it in here someplace? Maybe not. In the other classes I teach, I list all these documents and the historical information, but I can't give you compressed stuff for this. Zarathustra said, what did my people and the Pandavas do, O Sangai, when they assembled together on the holy field of Kurukshetra, desirous to do battle? And Sangaya said, seeing the army of the Pandavas drawn up in the battle array, the prince Duryodhana approached the preceptor and spoke these words. O preceptor, observe this grand army of the sons of Pandu, drawn up in battle array by your talented pupil, the son of Drapada. In it are heroes bearing large bows, the equals of Bhima and Agra in battle, namely Johanna, Virata, and Drapa, the master of the great car, etc., etc. The Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita is relatively coherent. And if you ever wondered why the Hare Krishna guys like to hand out the Bhagavad Gita, it's because it's coherent. Yes, ma'am?
Is that supposed to be historical, or is that mythical, like a Greek myth or something?
It's supposed to be historical, but the Bhagavad Gita is basically about a prince who is arrayed against his kinsman. So he's going to war against his kinsman, and Krishna, who is one of the avatars or whatever of the god, one of the gods, I can't remember which one, they have thousands of gods in Hinduism, is his charioteer. And so he convinces him that because of karma, it's okay to fight and kill his uncles and his cousins and his family. Because even if he was wrong, he is fated to it. Now that comes back to something that we can't ever forget when looking at the ancient world. You can't forget this. We will forget this because we'll go into Torah, because the Old Testament kind of represents this early, so we'll probably see it in the Torah. But you've got to remember that all religions start with animism. When we talk about all religions, I'm talking about this whole bulk of religions. Religions start with animism. They go to pantheonic paganism. They go to Mysterion. And they finally end up in Gnosticism. Gnosticism is new, and it's basically Christianity caused it. Very few have gone purely to Gnosticism, but most are stuck in Mysterion. Christianity looks like a Mysterion. That's why it appeals so much to the Greeks. In animism, what governs everything? pantheism, you have the fate of man, and you have the fate of gods. One is called pathos and chronos. The time of man, the time of gods. The fate of man, the fate of gods. Mysterion, you choose. It's choice. And Gnosticism, who knows? Gnosticism is knowledge. I mention this too because you can evaluate every religion except two. You can evaluate early Judaism using this. Remember? What did Abraham do? Abraham was a believer in the moon goddess, but he was called out of Ur by God, right? And decided to go a different way. He basically wasn't fated, he chose. Which is, by the way, remember in Hebrews, when we say Hebrews, right? He was convinced. Anyway, the point I'm making is this. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna convinces, I think it's Padu, anyway, the guy who's the prince, that it doesn't matter if he kills everybody, because it's his karma. What is karma? Fate. The New Testament, the whole message of the New Testament is you are not fated. One of the really strong messages of the Old Testament is this transition from the concept of fate to choice. God is not fated. Man is not fated. It's a huge transition. Why did it take the whole, well, this is a theological question. Why did it take the whole Old Testament to get there? We're slow learners. It took the Greeks a bazillion years to get there, right? Maybe I pushed the right button. Let's see. There we go. It took the Greeks a million years. Anyway, the Bhagavad Gita is relatively coherent, and I don't call it rational. I think when people understand it, they kind of go, well, that's not the way the world is. Would you?
So Anne asked the question, is it myth or is it historical? So was
It purports to be historical.
Did this prince really live and there
Is
really
there
was
any
a
evidence
battle?
that-
No.
That's already...
There's not really historical evidence. But, we'd have to get into that, what we'd have to do. Study the veracity of the documents themselves. And I gave you some information. See, do I have it in here? The epics. Actually, the epics, yeah. Date of events, about 1000 BC. The date of writing is about 540 BC. The earliest extant manuscript is about 100 AD. The lapse from the events of the writing is 400 years. What do you think? If
Is it kind of like King Arthur, where we don't really even know if there was a King Arthur, but it's mostly myth now, but there may have been a King Arthur.
Yeah, right. Was there a Buddha? We don't know. There's a bunch of there's a bunch of people in history that we've tried to identify as Buddhas, but the earliest writings of Buddha, where's my Buddhism? The Great Directive, okay? The author's lifespan, 400 BC. The date of the events was 632 to 543. The day of the writing, the earliest extant manuscript, the lapse of writing to the events was over 100 years. Okay? The extent of the writing, the people who wrote about Jesus, okay, in the New Testament is the greatest example. Well, all right. According to the Hebrews, who wrote the Torah? No. God wrote the Torah and gave it to Moses. Now we'll get to that because we're going to look at it in the Hebrew. But God gave the Torah to Moses. Moses didn't write it. But if Moses even wrote it, and it's about Moses, it is about Moses, so what kind of witness is it?
Well, part of it, like Genesis is not about Moses.
Well, we have a problem, and that's a problem we'll discuss. We'll talk about that when we get into the problem. Like I said, I think it's the 22nd chapter of Genesis. I have a problem with everything to the 22nd chapter because, one, there's no eyewitness account. So it's just as good as the Bhagavad Gita. It's as good as Buddhism. Up to 22nd. But once I get past the 22nd, what do I have? I have first person and second person accounts, right? So presumably, okay, if God handed you a manuscript that's about you and you read it, you'd probably say, hey, that's pretty good, right? But if it was wrong, you'd probably say, hey, that's wrong. Now, the oral Torah was supposed to correct any inconsistencies, right? But you can't change the Torah. The oral Torah is not the Torah. Make sure that's clear. It's got to be really clear. Okay? So, in any case, Bhagavad Gita is pretty, the padas are poetry, so, like the Psalms. Hindu bibliographical tests, large gap. I've got information on these. I usually teach a specific class in each of these. So you're getting just the pieces. Buddhism, the sutras. We have the sutras, which are basically, here's a sutra. The sutras are not historical. They are mostly sayings. So they're sayings of Buddha. And by the way, anyone remember what's the sayings of Christ document? No.
I can't remember.
The Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is a sayings gospel. It's the only one that's extant. It is a Gnostic document. What makes it unique is it's sayings without the narrative. All the New Testament documents are sayings bundled with the narratives. A new type of literature that C.S. Lewis said was new in the world. And I agree. The Buddhist sutras are sayings of Buddha. And here's a saying. And in the passing out of the state between consciousness and unconscious, he fell into a state in which consciousness both of sensations and of ideas had wholly passed away. Then the Venerable Andana said to the Venerable Amadura, O my Lord, O Andura, the Blessed One is dead. Nay, Brother Anda, the Blessed One is not dead. He has entered into that state in which both sensations and ideas have ceased to be. And those 500 brethren, what this is the narrative in the beginning of the sutras.
Sounds like narrative.
It's a narrative beginning into the sutras, which then goes into so I didn't have any of the quotes, because this is the part that's most, applicable to history. So this is supposed to be what happened, and there are some others, and they are, as I said, the manuscripts are fragments, and they're very late date, at least 100 years after his death. And there's no record until about 250 AD. Let's see. Archaeology. Jainism is a modern. Even talk about that. Bibliographical. It's modern. Like I said, I won't go through every detail. There's a specific class I could teach on this, but we're going to do the Torah. Sikhism is a modern. It's from Hinduism. There are some documents. Let's see, do I have anything else in here? Confucianism, the Book of I Ching. There are very few copies left. They're poems, odes, fragments. You guys may have even seen the I Ching. You could get them at Scholastic with the things you roll, and it gives you prophecies, or supposedly you could tell predictions based on what you roll in the I Ching. They're written down at least 70 years after Confucius' death, so Confucius didn't write them anyway. Bibliographical, etc. They were most of them were destroyed anyway by one of the kings. Taoism, Islam. You should take a look and read the Quran just for fun of it. Like you should look at the Book of Mormon and just see what it is. I'm not gonna. I've got some reading things, but mostly it's a collection. There is some purported history in it, but it's not to the time. It's history about Abraham. And where do you think he got it? Matter of fact, old Muhammad went to visit Jerusalem, and he went to visit. Where was the center of Christianity when Muhammad was alive? Actually, it was the Levant. It was in Jerusalem. The center of Christianity was Jerusalem. And so he went to Jerusalem where the Jews and Christians were and studied Christian documents and studied. And so it's kind of funny. They look a lot like the Old Testament documents because you kind of borrowed the information. That's where you got a source of information.
Change the sun.
No, well, that's Mormonism, yeah.
No,
No.
that's a
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Well, the Quran actually doesn't say, and some Muslims do believe it's Isaac, but most of them believe it's Ishmael. Most of them see themselves as
Yeah.
I was going to ask where does Islam fall in that pattern? Because they went from pantheonic paganism, because that was Muhammad's big beef, was getting rid of all these different gods they worshipped. So number 3 then was monotheism, but it's still, philosophy is still one mostly a faith.
They are a mysterion that is similar to pantheonic paganism. And the way they are among one of the keys of mysterion is it usually moves to monotheism. So Judaism moved to monotheism very early. That's one of the interesting things. And it also has a lot of tendencies of mysterion. Islam is classic mysterion.
It doesn't have anything that's like a secret, like you have to join and then you find out later.
Where do you go? If you want salvation in Islam, what do you have to do?
The 5 pillars of Islam, but also there's a faith component.
Right.
Because you have to be a Muslim and you're supposed to do all those deeds. But Allah is the final decider. And I think a lot of the people that do terrorism, it's like desperation to have a choice instead of faith. Because the one thing it says in Muhammad's sayings in the Hadith is that the one way you're guaranteed to get to paradise is dying in jihad. So, like, they have no other way. They're just fated one way or the other.
Well, the point I'm making is this. In the Islamic ideas, to make your progression in the pillars, right? One of the things is you have to go and visit the places and
The
see
Hajj.
them, right?
One of them is the
You have to
Hajj.
go to, there's 2 main ones. One of them is you got to go look at the meteorite.
Yeah, Mecca.
The
They have all
meteorite,
different things. Yeah, the stone in the Kaaba, and you have to circle it.
which is exactly like the Mysterions, very similar to the Greek Mysterions. When we reached a certain level of knowing the secrets were revealed to you.
But it's not exactly a secret, because we all know that. But is it sort of, like, because non-Christians or non-Muslims are not even allowed in Mecca, is that sort of...
You're making steps to perfection, to the secrets. And so if you know all the secrets, if you've passed all the secrets, you've gone to the, in different levels, right? Then now you have achieved. That's not, how different is that from the Masons, for example, who are a Mysterion? Or the Mormons that are Mysterion, right? So the secrets are revealed. How different is that from Mithras? Mithras, where, the secret is in a box. It was a sword and a phallic symbol and a thing of grain. Those are the secrets of the universe. 86 or 87. 42. Right? 6 times 7, 42. Anyway, the point is that Mysterions always have some secret, some level of revelation that you have to achieve for salvation, which is different than Christianity, because in Christianity, what is it? Christ died, Christ risen, Christ will come again. You give it up front, right? And so if you are convinced of that, then you are a Christian, right? It's not a mystery. The mystery of faith, this is the irony of the mystery of faith. What's the irony of the mystery of faith?
It's not a mystery.
It's not a mystery, but that's why in any other religion, okay, every other religion, what do you got to do in Buddhism if you want to achieve? What do you got to do?
Follow the 9 paths or whatever.
And achieve revelation, right?
Yeah,
You
enlightenment or...
transcend the world, right? Die like Buddha. How about in Hinduism?
Well, you gotta live your life, so you're hopefully
It's a
reincarnated in a
yeah,
better level and then
reincarnated.
eventually you reach nirvana.
Do you see why this appealed to the world? When they said, what do I got to do to be a Christian? Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. And they go, is that it? And they said, yeah. And they go, cool. I'm going for that, right? As opposed to, I mean, I'm spending my whole life, and eventually I get to look at a sword and a seed and a phallic symbol. Just saying, you know, I would be disappointed. You know, at least the Pythagorean theorem has some basis, right? You do something with it, but to see, oh, a sword, a phallic symbol, and a seed. And I spent my whole life waiting for this. Just saying. So anyway, if we remember this, you know, this is an important kind of thing. Anyway, so the internal test, that's what we're looking at, the degree of witness, primary, secondary, tertiary, geographically, chronological base. The Old Testament documents are mostly primary and secondary. We have some tertiary sources. They are geographically placed, and they're chronologically present. When we say that, we mean they're written in that period. And so I'm going to draw it again. We're talking about 1000 BC to about 532 BC. I think that's correct. Anyway, in my notes. I should pick up my notes because we'll be able to hit all the good points. Anyway. All right, so historical claims. Does the Torah claim to be historical? Yeah, big time. Although, and I hate this, don't tell me the stories. I know we like to say the stories of Jesus, right? Stories. They're not stories. They're histories, right? They're accounts. It's really funny that we have started calling them stories. That's a Turbingen school issue. I'm going to Turbingen school anyway. The Old Testament documents are almost unique in antiquity. They're almost unique because they claim to be historically placed and claim primary witness. For example, we were talking about the Bhagavad Gita. That claims to be a primary witness, right? But is it? No, it can't be. Why? It was written down 400 years after it occurred. So, you know, how could I get it? It has to be, okay, so maybe there was a battle, and maybe there was an eyewitness, and maybe somebody was there, right? But to get to 450 years later and be written down, what happened? Somebody passed it to somebody who passed it to somebody who passed it to somebody who passed it to somebody, and finally you get to, it's not even hearsay by then.
How about divine inspiration?
That is an interesting thing we'll talk about. The problem with divine inspiration, and especially when we talk about, you know, when we talk about veracity, where does divine inspiration go? None. Because the problem with divine inspiration is, if I want to hand you the Bhagavad Gita, what do I tell you? It's divinely inspired. If I want to hand you Islam, the Quran, I say it's divinely inspired. If Joseph Smith hands you the Book of Mormon, right? Appealing divine inspiration is appealing to magic. And I don't mean that in a sacrilegious fashion. I'm just telling you, our job is to convince the world. Right? Now, maybe in the modern world you convince people of magic because they believe in crystals and vitamins. And they believe in all kinds of stuff, you know, drugs that are not proven by the FDA. They believe in all kinds of stuff that science doesn't necessarily prove or support, right? So the problem you have in the modern world, maybe you can convince people that way because they're not. The problem is what happened to them. What happened on the way to school? Or what happened on the way to home from school? What did they teach them in school?
Whatever they want.
Yeah.
Basically, you're right, whatever they want. Well, they took God out of the school, so they're not teaching the Torah in the Old and the New Testament, right? Yes, sir.
But the first person to write it down in that time did so at a substantial cost and was convinced to do so for some reason, yes? Writing wasn't cheap. I mean, they didn't go to the supply closet and get their favorite ink pen and a pad of legal paper and start writing it down. They had to go through some cost to do that.
Yeah,
And why would they incur that opportunity cost if they weren't persuaded that it was perhaps divinely inspired?
I agree 100%. And that's why the primary witness, that's a great New Testament argument. The problem with the Old Testament, and I don't disagree with you, in the Old Testament it's a very similar kind of thing. As a matter of fact, the Hebrews were venerated by almost every society they met. Why? Because they had recorded history and nobody else did. Matter of fact, we don't know why Xerxes or Herodotus and Theodocles began to write the histories of the Greek people like they did. It may have been, though, because they were influenced by Hebraic ideas. Remember, they wrote their stuff down about 500 BC. Look at the end. That's the last manuscript in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh, right? In any case, Old Testament almost uniquely in antiquity claim to be historically placed. Only other documents that make such claims are acknowledged histories. Does the Bhagavad Gita claim to be history? No. It claims to be a account, but it doesn't say this is a historical account. It just says this is what happened, right? In the Old Testament, it says specifically, this is an account of, or this is a historical, thing. Theodocles says it's a history. Josephus says he was writing a history. Luke says he was writing a history. So the idea, now you could also say, you could argue, that really until the Greeks, remember the Greeks invented the legal historical method. So until the Greeks, things weren't, considered histories or really written down. So what I'm telling you is this. The Veracity tool is a tool that we can use to prove the veracity of the documents we are going to study. And that's the point, right? Because if you go to approach, let's say, and I've done this. I've actually had people ask me. I had a young man that was Hindu that talked to me about the Old Testament, New Testament documents at a Young Life thing. And he just wanted to know, and I explained to him some of the basics of the veracity of the Old and New Testament, which, to an educated person, or to a person who should be educated, right, this is a great approach. It doesn't refer, to believers, we can say it's inspired, right? And what do we say? Cool, I love it. But to non-believers or to people that are really questioning, it's very difficult, especially in the modern era. You're not going to convince somebody saying, well, God wrote it, right? It's difficult. In spite of what we'll look at in the Torah, which will be very interesting, because the Torah makes some very interesting claims that are beautiful, in my opinion. So, compared to other works in antiquity, the Old Testament documents fulfill all the internal qualifications at least as well, if not better than any other work. So they're equal, they're equivalent. And based on the bibliographical and internal tests, a work is always historically given the benefit of the doubt. Every historian in the world knows that. Every historian knows this. This is not debatable. So based on bibliographical and internal tests, historical claims of the Old Testament can be assumed to be as true as any other book of antiquity. So if you're going to trust Caesar, you better trust the Old Testament. If you're going to trust Hammurabi, you're going to need to trust the Old Testament, right? Now that puts them on equivalence. So let's look, we also compare to other works. That's the external test, same region, same time period in archaeology. So in the external test, it's based on lack of works in antiquity, you could compare the works of the Old Testament to each other, right? How many works in antiquity are there between 1000 and 532 BC? Not a whole lot. You can read them. I've read them all. You can read them all. They're there. So, and I listed most of them for you. In the class I teach, I list all of them. But I've got all the lists of all of them. You can all go and read them. So based on you, as a matter of fact, the Old Testament is made up of, are they singular works or multiple works? They're multiple, right? They're multiple. So they are like, and this is why I don't really like, I shouldn't say Old Testament, I should say Old Testament documents. I don't like Old Testament because it presumes that they're a cohesive whole. than most countries have been a country, right? So this is a huge amount of time. This meets the external tests in every respect. There are small deviations between documents, mostly based in numbers. Why? Because remember what I first started with, right? The Hebrew language. There are problems with numbers because the consonants are numbers. So when you're reading it, how do you know it's a number or a letter? It's very difficult to tell. So the problem that you see, and this is what you hear all the time. I just want to warn you, what do you hear all the time? You know it.
There's contradictions.
There are contradictions in the numbers. A person who is adequately educated, in my opinion, will tell you, well, duh, because they're consonants. How do you know they're right? Even the rabbis can't tell. You understand? The rabbis who studied Hebrew for their entire lives trying to translate and get that right will tell you there are problems. And between 1,000 to 532, what do you expect? Do you think, okay, I showed you how TH in English used to be the thorna and the ash, right? You didn't know that, did you? The thorna and the ash. And today, we write ye olde curiosity shop because it used to be a thorna and they turned it into a Y because they didn't know better. This is hard TH, this is soft TH. In English, we don't use these symbols anymore. How many years ago was that? This changed about the time of Chaucer, right about the time of Chaucer. Has anybody read Chaucer? Yeah. Everybody's read Chaucer, right? Well, hopefully in British Lit. So this is something that is in our history. And you say, has our language changed? Has our vocabulary changed? Right? Even the pronunciation of things have changed. And we're not talking, I mean, what are we talking? Maybe 1,500 years? Here we're talking about 500 years. More than 500 years. Right? So, time changeth all things. I think that's on the side of our freeway. Misquoted somehow. Anyway, the thing is that numbers are difficult in a language that uses consonants for the numbers. And so when a person says, well, there's deviations, look, in a world where people can count to 40, what do you have to say about numbers?
They're going to get screwed up.
They're about like people making estimates of how many people are in a crowd on the mall in Washington, right? Yeah, you talk to one group and it's like there's a bazillion. You talk to another group, there were 500. You talk to another group, there were 150. And I've been there because the Soviets were really good in the Cold War. They would take pictures of protesters through the fences. So there'd be 10 protesters in front of a base. And they would take the pictures through the protest, so you saw 1,000 people behind them. And they would say, yes, 10,000 people were expected to be at this protest. And there were 10. The Soviets were really tricky about that. And guess what? The American press used to see it in Stars and Stripes. I was there at Ramstein. I see 10 people outside the gate during the guest thing where they invited all the Germans on the base. And there'd be 10 protesters. And Stars and Stripes would do the same thing. They'd have a picture through the protesters showing 10,000 people, behind the fence. But you can focus it just right so you don't see the fence very well. Pretty tricky. Now today in Photoshop, you can take out all those and you kill all the people off. That's what the Riskies did, even when they Photoshopped them out pretty well too. Anyway, you see that. The other complaint is you get synopsis body. In other words, you can see it. You go to Wikipedia and see it. Oh, there are 2 creation accounts. One was added later. Wait. Okay. Do we have any documents that show one creation account separate from another? Okay, so why? Okay, if somebody came and told you, I have no documents to prove it, like Q. How many Q's are there? You know what Q is? Q is what is the sayings gospel that the whole New Testament is supposed to be based on, the synoptic gospels. How many copies of Q exist? Zero. They never found one. There never has been one. No one even talked about one in antiquity. No one even referenced it. There's never been a Q. So if anybody says something about Q, what would you say? Show me. There has never been evidence that there are separate creation stories in accounts, creation histories, in any of the Torah documents. Why would someone think there is?
They don't understand how it's written.
Because they don't understand the synopsis body construction that the Hebrew literature is written in.
And they're looking for a way to say it's right, too.
They're trying to understand a Hebrew ancient document from 1000 BC in terms of Latin or English norms. That is crazy, okay? That is nuts. And they're teaching history someplace. Well, most universities, okay? There's also changes over time. For example, and we'll study this, in the sacrifices. Who does the sacrifices in the Torah? No, they don't. In the Torah, the individual who brings the sacrifice sacrifices the animal. In Nehemiah and Jeremiah, who does the sacrifice? The priest. So many so-called, I'm going to say it, so-called scholars, not rabbis, the rabbis know better because they understand this, will tell you, in the Torah it says that the individual sacrifices the animal. In Nehemiah, it says that the priests do it. So therefore, there is a contradiction. And I will say, no, it's 500 years. We know what happened, all right? We know what happened. Remember, in Bethlehem, look at the example, a beautiful example. In Bethlehem, Judea, the only time you're going to find lambs at Bethlehem is in Passover, because they are the sacrificial lambs being kept by the Levites, the priests. Because the problem at that time was people, it was a rig, it was a setup. If you brought your lamb, and they're supposed to inspect the lamb, what did they say about your lamb? It's inferior. Look, there's a spot right here. And so they say, but you can trade your lamb in, and for only 5 years and 5%, we will sell you a lamb, and you can pay installments, right? And so that's what they did, and that's the way the priesthood made their bucks. We know historically, ask your rabbi. The rabbis will tell you. The problem with the sacrifice was the people would bring their sacrifice and they would botch it. They'd botch it, and what would happen? So you brought, let's say you brought a heifer. You brought a cow, right, to the priest for a sacrifice, and you botched it. How much is a cow worth? Anybody buy cows? $2,000, right? We're talking big money here. And guess what? In that day, cows were more expensive. So you just took $2,000 and flushed it down the toilet. Period. Literally. So what happened is, by the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, the priests were doing the sacrifices. We know this. You know who tells us this? Josephus tells us this. So when a person says, I see changes over time in 500 years of the Old Testament, of the Tanakh, what do you say? Duh. You know, is there something wrong with your brain? Right?
And they recorded it.
And they recorded it. And they recorded it because it's
History.
It's history. Yeah, don't forget, it's history. You don't write bad stuff when you're writing myths. Right? If you're writing myths, Do you tell us that Samson was seduced by Delilah and had his eyes gouged out and then broke the temple? Do you tell us that David committed adultery with Bathsheba and had Uriah killed?
Well, maybe because the Greek gods did all sorts of weird, rotten things.
Yeah, but the Greek gods did rotten things because they were fated. In the Old Testament, it's very clear. The people did what they did because they chose. Well, I don't like to use the word sinful. Some people chose good things, right? Some people chose bad. So it's not just sin, it's choice in what you do. And remember, well, I go back to Hebrews. The whole point of Hebrews was, it's not about what you sin because that's forgiven. It's about miss the mark. You should be aiming. The point of the New Testament is we've gotten past the point of sin. We're saying, don't worry about sin. Worry about achieving what you're supposed to achieve in the world. That's a huge, we're moving in, that's just a huge change in religious thought. It's amazing. Because guess what? Well, example. Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam. Who are you doing it for?
Yourself, to get yourself to heaven.
Is there any communal Buddhism? There is no communal salvation in Buddhism. It's you. If you don't achieve nirvana, who's going to achieve it? You're done. You're gone. Hinduism, the same way. Islam, if you don't achieve it, who's going to do it? No one. Now, Mormon, you can have baptized for your, unbelieving things. That's an interesting thought. But in Christianity, according to the New Testament, in Christianity, who are you doing Christianity for? The good of the world, the good of others, the good of everyone. You're bringing the message of the gospel because you found it, right? You are convinced others need it, right?
But it does say you need to keep yourself from falling away as well.
Well, I don't disagree. You need to continue in whatever that goodness, the righteousness, right? Diakutsu. I love the word diakutsu. You need to keep that going, and this is theological. Sorry, that's a theological. But anyway, yeah. But the point I'm trying to make is that is a huge difference in Christian thought that is not in any other religion at all.
The people at Pablo often say in their articles, like, they will help out these Muslim people or whatever, and they'll even cry and be like, my Muslim neighbors, the people at my mosque, never do anything like this for me, and I had all this need, and the Christians helped me out.
Well, I hope we're doing that. That's because that's what we are called to do, right? As opposed to the nation of our government taking all our money and basically giving it to people who we don't vet in some way for their needs. Anyway, but you don't have to depend on the Old Testament documents only. Here we go. Other histories substantiate the events and the facts in it. So we have external authenticity that's attested by Herodotus, by Josephus, and by many more. Josephus, of course, the problem with Josephus is not a primary source, right? He's a tertiary source, actually. But yet, Josephus is great because, well, all those professors at university believe it. They accept Josephus. So you're good. And Herodotus, too. Even though Herodotus has some eyewitness accounts, but some of them are secondary, and they're even calling into question some of those because of other historical documents. But that's okay. Archaeological evidence supports the works of the Old Testament. As time goes by, the evidence becomes better and better. At one time, Babylon and Troy were considered mythic. Today, they say you're nuts if you said they were mythic. But the Tübingen school was developed because they said it was mythic. Because Babylon was mythic, Troy was mythic, and they said Pontius Pilate didn't exist. But guess what we found? Coins, records, inscriptions. I'm like, every day you get more and more. Nothing in archaeology alters, refutes, or knowledge of any history described in the writings of the Tanakh. So based on a legal historical test, we can conclude that the written words of the books of the Tanakh are historical fact. In most cases, they're primary source historical fact. There's no reason to doubt their historical veracity, accuracy, or authority. You don't have to have a belief. what I said? You don't have to believe that these are at least the same veracity as other documents of history. You don't need belief. All you need is to read them, right? You don't need belief. Belief is necessary to accept the spiritual influence. That's theological. That's some theological tool, right? That's not what we're talking about. We want to establish veracity, so we have tools, right? And the tools we use will be then to work on it. And what are we going to look at? Okay, next, we are going to go into the names of God. And you say, why do we need to do the names of God? You got to know the names of God, because if you don't know the names of God, then reading the Torah is a problem. And also, we need to understand where the names of God came from and what they mean. So we'll look at the names of God, that specific thing. We are also then going to look at covenant. You say, why covenant? The only way to understand the Torah is you've got to understand the covenants. And they are, whether you want to, remember I said you can't defend up to 22. The only way you can do 22, up to 22 is, well, or, as the Jews say, God gave it. That's why I mentioned oral. The idea that the Torah was passed orally becomes very difficult from a standpoint of veracity. Because if, for example, if we presume that Moses wrote it, right, well, to 22, it's basically not a witness. If you presume that God gave it to him and can prove that point in the context of the Torah, or the claims of the Torah, then you may have a leg to stand on. But still, your problem is what? You're going to have to say, well, it's inspired. For us, that's a goodness, if you know where the Torah came from, right? It won't necessarily help you with your neighbor, but it's a good place to start and understand. It gives you a foundation for being able to argue these points or discuss these points with people. And that's the point. Thank you, Father, for your word of